right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and whenever you are. I'm Kelly, and I'm the head of adult services here at Cooper-Siegel Community Library in Fox Chapel, Pennsylvania. And I say that just in the hopes that we might get some remote viewers from who knows where. I have the absolute pleasure of sitting down and talking with Uma Satyavolu, who is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the English department. And just have to say, I felt kind of an instant kinship with you, Uma, as soon as we started emailing and talking. A fellow literature lover and book lover. So I just kind of have this instant connection. And Uma is going to talk about banned books, silenced and suppressed voices, which is something that librarians hold dear to our heart. And just the power of story, which again is such a part of our lives as librarians. And her passion is very, very contagious. And so hopefully you will also kind of experience that, even if it's remotely and virtually. And so I'll let Uma kind of talk a little bit more. You can talk a little bit more about yourself and your story, and then kind of just share all of these amazing pieces about banned books and silenced voices. And yeah, so I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm very, very happy to be here. It is a very great pleasure to talk about books. And in my profile on my website at the University of Pittsburgh, I talk about how much my love of books and reading has been a part of why I have become, a professor. I did not know when I was young that it was possible to be a librarian, or I would have become a librarian. That would have been my ideal job. So I'm very grateful to be here. My name is Uma Satyavolu. And one of the things that I like to say is that in my early 20s, one of the reasons why I decided I had to move to the United States was reading all the accounts of libraries with millions of volumes available to readers. And to me, reading came as naturally as breathing. In India, like many middle-class children, I grew up with 3 languages, my own Telugu and mother tongue, and then Hindi, which is the national language and the shared language of all my childhood friends, and then English at school. I went to a convent school, St. Anne's, so English was the medium of instruction. And so the idea that one would read widely across many different languages and cultures and literary traditions came naturally to me. And so that was my impetus. And what I was seeking was really a kind of scholarly and readerly freedom, if you like. And so to me, that always reading stories, telling stories is almost the thing that is a human impulse, but more importantly, it has implications for human rights. The UDHR 1948 Human Rights Declaration, which talks about the human right to pursue one's humanity to the fullest possible. And Wayne Booth, in his 1992 lecture, talks about human rights is the right to pursue a storyline, a life plot, the ability to make one's own life, but also like a novel. So the relationship between the novelistic aspect of readers and also making one's life like a Bildungsroman. We make our own plots, we make our own lives. And that's so much a part of the American sense of identity and American sense of what it means to be human. And so and Joseph Slaughter, who wrote a fantastic book called Human Rights, Inc., in which he traces this relation between novels and human rights, and how, starting in the 1700s, the rise of the novel is related to the rise of this greater sense of the human dignity and equality, so that you read stories like your own, Moll Flanders and so on. He calls it the right to narration. And I am very much interested in the ways in which the powers that be, I teach this in my banned books, the powers that be are always trying to preclude narratives, to erase narratives, and how so much of the work of reading is reading voices that you would not otherwise come across. And so that's part of how I teach my banned books. And of course, Ray Bradbury, if you say banned books, he says you don't have to burn books to destroy a culture, just get people to stop reading them, right? And so in a sense, the mission of the library, which we believe very much, is the mission of the university, which is to keep people reading books. And so today I want to talk about 3 or 4, depending on how much time it takes to do this, 3 or 4 instances in which women are central to the way in which narratives which would otherwise be lost are recuperated for our purposes. And I won't go into the history of censorship and banning and so on, except to say that censorship is at its broadest, the either state-sponsored or community-based objection, the challenge to remove or to otherwise curtail the access to information. So these are all ways in which women, I find, are behind the story. They are the story and they are behind the story of telling the story. And the first one, of course, is the very famous story of banning Ulysses, the book by James Joyce, which is essentially the banned book, if you want to think about it in that way. And the story of that, its publication, is that it was not ever published anywhere else. When Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, 2 women who were running a small magazine, a literary review called The Little Review, began to serialize Ulysses in between 1918 and 1920. And so they'd published the first few chapters and they had been confiscated. They had already run into some trouble with another story that they had published in which, a young woman is taken advantage of by a man and who gets her pregnant, and she writes him letters. He's away on the war front, and he then what we would call ghosts her. He doesn't answer her letters, and this outraged the public morality, so they were told that they could not publish this, and the copies of the Little Review were confiscated. This was in 1918 or so, but they still went ahead, and in between 1918 and 20 published the various chapters, the beginning chapters of Ulysses. And then in 1920, in April, they published the chapter called Nausicaa, which is a chapter in which Bloom, one of the 2 heroes, the protagonist of Ulysses, sees a young girl and fantasizes about her, and I don't know how to put it mildly, but it's a scene of public masturbation, and this girl recognizes him and sees what is happening, and yet, in a sense, participates in it by sort of exposing her leg. This is just too much, stocking shows. And so he this outrages people only because an unsolicited copy is sent to a young woman who then reports it to her father, who then reports it to John Sumner, a man who was a lawyer in New York, and he was the head of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and he thinks that this contaminates women, and so on. And so they bring a case against the two the two publishers, and it turns out that nobody is in favor of them. The judges are clearly hostile, but even their own lawyer, in a letter on October 16th, 1920, their lawyer, whose name is Quinn, who is the defense, says, "I have no interest at all in defending people who are stupidly and brazenly and saphoistically and pederastically and urinally and menstrually violating the law and think they are courageous." Right? So this is a story that at that time they tried to suppress, which is that the two women, Margaret Anderson and Jane, are living in what would today be a queer relationship. And clearly the disgust is, and the hostility is very obvious. And so the way in which the whole of the story works out is that they, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the notes. So the whole story is that the judge tells Margaret Anderson that she did not know what she was publishing, because she could not possibly have known that the metaphorical language in which James Joyce described Bloom's orgasm was really obscene, because she was a young lady and he calls her young lady. And so Jane Heap, in an article about the law and art, uses the phrase, "Girls lean back everywhere, and this happens, and women understand what it is, and it is you should not be paternalistic." And of course, everyone is paternalistic, and they fined the two, Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, are fined $100 and are forbidden from publishing any further installments of Ulysses. And so the women who publish this, the women who are at the cutting edge of what kinds of literature, what kinds of consciousness can be supported, are the women who are paternalistically seen to be not capable of knowing what great art is, what new forms of art are. And it is not until 1933 that the trial of Ulysses is redone in the US, and then the judge, famously Judge Woolsey, allows it to be published. Meanwhile, in 1922, Sylvia Beach, who is the founder of Shakespeare and Company, the great bookshop in Paris, the locus of so many expats from America in the 20s, between the wars. Sylvia Beach publishes in 1922 in Paris all of the Ulysses. And then Judge Woolsey, And the trial is brought in 1933. He says, Ulysses is not an easy book to read. It is brilliant and dull, intelligible and obscure by turns. In many places, it seems to me to be disgusting. But although it contains, as I have mentioned above, many words usually considered dirty, I have not found anything that I consider to be dirt for dirt's sake. Each word of the book contributes like a mosaic to the detail of the picture which Joyce is trying to construct for his readers. And so this is a landmark case which makes a great point for artistic freedom and becomes the founding principle of all publishing afterwards. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm just absolutely fascinated by this story. I studied Ulysses very briefly, and I have never read it, so I confess to that, but didn't know anything about this. And I just wondered two things. Did the women publishers, have they, or did they write anything, I guess, publicly about the experience at the time? And then when the kind of trial was happening in the 30s, is there anything that they wrote about, their response to this happening?
Absolutely. She actually wrote a memoir, Margaret Anderson, which I would also recommend, and I'm trying to find in my notes where that is.
Well, and we can promise everyone that in the kind of YouTube notes, we'll list, the books and authors so that people can find them and explore them more, because I certainly am interested in what
Absolutely.
they had to say. Yeah.
So she, yes, there is, but Margaret Anderson wrote her own a famous memoir, and before the trial itself, Jane Heap published that article that I was talking about, Law and Art, in which she expresses her objections. And these are two really founding documents. Without them and without their courage and without their sense of what is, new, it would not have been possible for Ulysses to have been published anywhere. So I think that, and it's interesting, little review, Ezra Pound, who, is thought of as the great sort of person who makes great poetry, modernist poetry possible. He was the European editor for them, and he, in fact, recommends it to them. So it's a kind of an interesting take. And absolutely, I will find those texts for you and put
Sure.
them.
And then one more question, just personally, what do you enjoy Ulysses? Have you, I'm sure you've read it. What do you think?
I have read it several times. It is, I enjoy it in the sense that I like its complexity. I am not by nature someone who likes scatological things. So I remember being young and thinking, ew, this is, Virginia Woolf famously says that it's like a teenager scratching his pimples, whatever. But there is, it is, once you understand the structure, once you see what he's doing with the Homeric, that he is modeling it on various episodes from Homer's Odyssey. And once you see the complexity, once you see all the interesting things, for instance, each of the chapters is based on a genre of, so he uses drama, stage play in one chapter. He writes this Nausicaa chapter that I was talking about is very much based upon a magazine fiction. So it's kind of a parody of magazine fiction, and that's why there are shooting fireworks, and that's Bloom's sort of orgasmic feeling. And he writes it in such a way that he both exploits and parodies women's fiction and the ways in which it talks about romance and eroticism, which just goes to the edge of sexuality and comes back. And he's doing so many interesting and beautiful and vital things and talking about things which had never been talked about before. And it's very interesting because in that story, the Gertie, the young girl who is participating in this sort of scene of sexuality is very innocent and also very knowing. And there is a complexity to that character which would not, we would not otherwise have. I have read it and I would recommend it, although I am a Finnegan's Wake fan myself. And that is another level of, you know, weird and beautiful and strange. So I would recommend Nausicaa if, you know, just on its own as a chapter. And it is related to Homer's, there is an episode where Odysseus washes up on the shores of the island where Nausicaa, this young girl, lives, and she goes out and she is washing the clothes in preparation for her marriage, dowry, whatever, and he washes up on the shore and he sees this beautiful young girl and he thinks, you know, and she allows him to bathe, and then she goes and tells the story, his own story, and her father helps him to get back to his. So this is this young girl whom the hero, who is by this point quite older, encounters, and he does interesting things. Joyce does interesting things with the Homeric story, and it's a fabulous thing. And I cannot tell you enough, and you know, I would recommend it very much.
Well, that's nice to hear. It's certainly, I think, you know, kind of infamous and notorious in for English majors and writers to grapple with and think about Ulysses, and it's something I've always felt too intimidated to read, so maybe I'll try it.
No, one way to think about it is to enter through Nausicaa, and then think about it as it's a journey through Dublin, but it's also a journey that, you know, of trying to get home. And it's very, and one of the things I always tell my students is that you should not be afraid to know what it is about beforehand, because you don't read Ulysses to find out what happens, right? Always a kind of an account. And this is something also important, because if you grow up in a book culture, the books are always spoiled for you. Somebody has always already talked about it. You hear somebody say what's happening in it, or, you know, they'll give away the plot, they'll give away the most interesting scenes, but that's okay. That's not why you're reading it. You're reading it because of how and not what, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's very comforting. So maybe I will pick it up. So thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And so that is a very interesting story, the women behind that story. And the 20th century seems to be absolutely about, you know, all kinds of upheavals, as we know, and the great story of the erasure of history, revision of history, of course, is the Second World War, Nazi fascism, and also Stalinist sort of communist, I was going to say excesses, but you know, the extraordinary human disaster that happens. Millions of people in, you know, not only in war, but also in famines created by policies of Stalin and obviously Hitler and others. So the other person I would want to talk about is Vasily Grossman. He is a voice. He's one of the greatest writers. Robert Musil is another one. Proust, Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, Rebecca West, who wrote about great wars. You know, the women are not usually spoken of. But the two novels that I would recommend, he wrote a dialogy. One is called Life and Fate, which is clearly sort of playing off War and Peace, Tolstoy, the great Russian writer. The only book people seem to have reread in during the war, Second World War in Russia, seems to be in War and Peace. And certainly Grossman himself is a writer. He was the first one to describe a concentration camp, the Hell of Treblinka, in September 1944, the Nazis had erased this camp, got rid of all the evidence, but he traced down survivors, he traced down the local people, and he was the first one to report on the method and the actual physical structures and the horror of it. And he was a journalist who was embedded with the Red Army, so he knew exactly how these things were happening, and he was at the forefront, and he had an extraordinary recall as a writer, and his war writing dispatches are very, he was a reporter, but that reporterly attitude he brings to these two novels, which basically within the Soviet structure, within the Soviet tightly controlled structures of what it is possible to say, he writes these stories of, one of them, Life and Fate, is about the several characters during the World War and how they are fighting on the front. And Stalingrad is, of course, his account of the battle for Stalingrad, where there is a big siege, and it's a very famous sort of event. And one of the things that Grossman found out is that his book was, quote, arrested. It's one of the most interesting things that happened is that after the World War, when the enemy stopped being the Nazi Hitlerian regime, the internal enemies were the Jewish people. So there is a revived and virulent anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness in post-war Stalinist Soviet Union. And one of the things that happens is that they take away his novel because it cannot be published in the form that he's writing in, because it is realistic, it is naturalistic, it's telling too many truths about the way actually Soviet Union is. And so, but one of the things that the writer talks about is he becomes increasingly aware of the fascist nature or of the totalitarian nature of his own culture. And so Everything Flows is a third novel he was working on after the two novels could not be published, and there is it's a very notorious way. They came and they took away even the ribbons on which he was writing, but unknown to anyone, he had already given a draft to someone who smuggled it out of there, and for a long time it could not even be published in the West because of expat, or the Russians who were outside the Soviet Union were anti-Semitic, and they couldn't believe that a Jewish writer could write about Russia in any meaningful way. So who is he? Who does he think he is to write the great Russian novel? That's what Sholokhov said. The novel structure, and this is Everything Flows. So he fights and fights even until throughout the 50s to get his novels published, and he recognizes that this is a terrible system. And Everything Flows is a book that he had been working on. It's essays. He describes what it means to be coming back from the gulags. He describes a character who has survived the starvation in Ukraine, comes back and tells the story, which is the story, the mother of his mother. And so the woman telling the story of the famine, that was created, and that she was, in a way, making possible, and then she tells the story, is embedded into this very short novel. The others are 900 pages each, the dialogy, but this one, it's a mixed, it's a beautiful, very interesting genre. And the novel structure, says the translator Raymond Chandler, he says, Robert Chandler, that is Robert Chandler, he says, the novel structure, however schematic, carries meaning. Central to this structure is the idea that the telling of stories, of histories, the telling of my story and your story, of her story and his story, can be a gift. In the first chapters, Ivan and his cousin Nikolai approach their long-awaited meeting with great hopes. Ivan hopes to be released from the burden of all that he has seen and suffered in the camps. Nikolai, a successful scientist, hopes to be released from the burden of the guilt he feels on account of all the compromises he has made in order to stay free. Nikolai, however, feels threatened by Ivan's presence and the breath of the camps he brings with him, and no real conversation, no true exchange of stories takes place. Ivan leaves abruptly, right? The stories that cannot be told, even when you have to tell the stories. Lonelier and more burdened than ever. In the second half, however, Ivan finds understanding and love, and the failed conversation between the cousins is balanced by a true conversation between Ivan and his lover. So the possibilities of telling your story and being sort of the gift of being able to tell your story. Grossman is simply doing what he can to remember the lives and deaths of millions who have been too little remembered. Ivan accepts this immense gift, right? Anna Sergeyevna, that is the lover, who is a thinly veiled sort of character based on his own mother, account of the terror famine, an act of genocide in which she was complicit, is a gift of love. She tells her story lucidly with absolute trust and with absolute truthfulness. She's not trying to escape her pain by inflicting it on Ivan, nor is Grossman trying to escape his own pain by inflicting it on the reader. Grossman is simply doing what he can to remember the lives and deaths. Ivan accepts this immense gift, this gift of love and trust, and he does his best to reply in kind. And to me, always that notion of the telling of stories, the more difficult the story, the greater and more immense the gift and the debt, and the burden, and also the reception of it. And so I wanted to talk about these stories, the stories behind these stories. And one of the things that Grossman had to live with all his life was that he felt guilty that he hadn't called his mother, who was living in the south of the Soviet Union, back to Moscow in time to escape this pogrom in which she dies, and she sends him a letter. And in the two novels, that letter is this shadow that he carries in his pocket, literally and metaphorically, throughout the thing. And then we get this story of what happened, where she describes what happens to essentially East European, Central European Jewry, Jews so that's the story that I wanted to tell, and I would want your readers, your patrons, to know. Everybody should read Life and Fate and Stalingrad. These two very difficult. You will feel wrung out. You will feel as if all of your life has been taken out, but you will also feel so enriched and so grateful, and I hope renewed in your sense that that should not happen again.
A good book does that. It kind of empties and fills you. And so that's a really good kind of teaser for a great read. We all love that. I like being destroyed and rebuilt by books. So it sounds like those two would absolutely do that.
Absolutely. And there is so much life. You learn so much about Russia and about what it means to be a human being and what it means to have courage and what it means to make compromises. Grossman himself, who was this intrepid person, at one point signed a letter against the so-called Jewish doctors who were actually liquidated by Stalin in a purge. And he signed this letter thinking, other Jewish people would be spared if we said not all Jews were like that. And he instantly regretted it. But of course, I mean, it would have happened anyway. It's not anything that he did, but he felt complicit in this thing that happens, and he lives with that guilt, and he writes this great book as a kind of an expiation. So that is another story. And there are so many that I wish related to that is Nadezhda Mandelstrom, who's also about writing in the about the poet Josip Mandelstrom, who is one of actually the greatest 20th century Russian poet. And sadly, until recently, nobody had read any translations, but now there is one of the most magnificent translations of Mandelstrom's poetry available, and we should all read it. But Hope Against Hope. Nadezhda Mandelstrom was his wife. He was sent by Stalin to the gulags in 1934, and her memoir, she then became, like in the Bradbury story, the living repository of the poetry, all the poems. We don't think of ourselves as memorizing poetry, and how central poetry is to Russian, to some cultures. And she memorizes all the vast conspectus, hundreds of poems. And for a long time, that was the only way those poems existed. And then she would write them down on scraps of paper and pass them on to visitors or to people who would smuggle it out of Soviet Russia and collect them outside and publish them. She then, her name, Nadezhda, means hope, and she knew English very well. She knew many different languages. She made her living as a translator and as a teacher of English in various provincial towns, because she was always trying to keep outside Stalin's, arresting her. And I think she was too well known, and even he did not feel he could touch her. But she was always expecting to be sort of liquidated, arrested. So she wrote this memoir, two books. The first one is called Hope Against Hope, and Joseph Brodsky, the man, the poet who won the Nobel Prize and who then became a dissident poet outside, he went to visit her. He knew her well, and he describes her as, someone who was a vinegary, Brechtian, steel-hard woman of great intelligence, limitless courage, no illusions, permanent convictions, and a wild sense of the absurdity of life. She and the other great Russian poet, Anna Akhmatova, whom I would also recommend to your readers very strongly. Josip Mandelstrom wrote an epigram on Stalin. It was a parody. It was a kind of a satire on we live deaf to the land beneath us, 10 steps away, no one hears our speeches. But where there's so much as half a conversation, the Kremlin's mountaineer will get his mention. His fingers are fat as grubs, and words, final as lead weights, fall from his lips. His cockroach whiskers leer, and his boot tops gleam. Around him, a rabble of thin-necked leaders, fawning half-men for him to play with. They whinny, purr, or whine as he prates and points a finger, one by one forging his laws to be flung like horseshoes at the head, the eye, or the groin. And every killing is a treat for the broad-chested Ossete. And that he was Ossetian, he's Georgian, but he wanted to pretend. So he recited this poem. It's not even that he published it. He recited it in the street to someone once. And that person heard the poem, memorized it, and went and informed on the poet. and he was taken away in the middle of the night. And Nadezhda records this. So the whole of the first is how the first chapter is about how they came and took him away in the middle of the night and while they were visiting. And just to give you a sense of why you should read this book, Hope Against Hope is the title of this memoir. After slapping Alexei in the face, M immediately returned to Moscow. And this is an incident that, you know, he's supposed to have insulted Nadezhda. So so it's very interesting for us to think about how central a role poetry plays in the lives of even the people who hate you will remember the poem because it is so great. And in Grossman's book, the censor, the person who was Stalin's second hand in terms of establishing who can publish and what can be published, says this book cannot be published for 200 or 300 years, right? Which acknowledges that it is a kind of an eternal book that will survive, that, you know, is a book for the ages. So I would recommend Nadezhda Mandelstam and Osip Mandelstrom's poetry. Those are banned books in Russia, but which we should remember. They're great art. They're not just because they tell us something in themselves, they're great art. And that's also important to me, not simply as record, although that is enough in itself. And the other great set of poems that I would like us to learn about and to think about are these poems called Lande. And should I put it in the chat so that L-A-N-D-A-Y, Lande. It's a short form of poem, 22 syllables, 9 syllables in the top and 20 and 13 in the second line. Landa means a short or a small snake. And it is usually a satirical or a biting poem. It expresses both longing and also wistfulness and satire. And it has to have a bite. It has to be small, but deadly, like a snake that is short. So that's the name. And for this, there is a really great Eliza Griswold is her name, and she went and did work with Murphy, photographer. The two of them go, and her name, this woman, these days, and for women, poetry programs on the radio are one of the few permissible forms of access to the outside world. This was around 2001 or so, just after the Taliban had taken over. Such was the case for Rahila Muska. Muska means smile, who learned about a women's literary program called Mirman Bahir via the radio. The group meets in the capital of Kabul every Saturday afternoon. It also runs a phone hotline for girls from the provinces like Muska to call in with their own work or to talk to fellow poets. Muska, which means smile in Pashto, phoned in so frequently and showed so much promise that she became the darling of the literary circle. She alluded to family problems that she refused to discuss. And this is, I'm reading Eliza Griswold's account. One day, in the spring of 2010, Muska phoned her fellow poets from a hospital bed in the southeastern city of Kandahar to say that she had set herself on fire. She had burned herself in protest. Her brothers had beaten her badly after discovering her writing poems. Poetry, especially love poetry, is forbidden to many of Afghanistan's women. It implies dishonor and free will. Both are unsavory for women in traditional Afghan culture. Soon after, Muska died, right? And I know that this sounds horrible, and it sounds almost like a travesty to even talk about beauty or anything that is good out of this. but I also feel that that longing for having one's identity recognized, to name oneself and to make one's identity through poetry, to have a shared circle. And this is still the case, especially again now after the, the troops have been withdrawn from Afghanistan, and the prospects for women are looking bleaker and bleaker because the Taliban are likely to be in power. This is a very timely thing. The whole thing is on poetry.org. I would recommend your readers read it and learn about it. And more recently, I came across a story in Al Jazeera where they talked about the librarian who holds on to the old Afghan poetry. He's 81 years old, and it's one of the few public libraries in Afghanistan. And he goes every day. He's retired now, but he goes every day. And there were pictures of him sitting just as you are now. And there is a bullet hole the size of a quarter right above in the glass right behind you. And there's this sort of cobweb-like thing from the short thing, but he's sitting there, and there are groups of Sufi poets and poetry enthusiasts who come and listen to him. And there's one lone woman in the among the participants, and that seemed to me such an extraordinary act of resistance, right? Sufism itself, the Sufi movement itself, is a resistance against the Taliban sort of puritanical form of Islam. So these are some of the stories and some of the poets and some of the voices, narratives that we should be recuperating. And the reason why literature is not just entertainment. It is something so much more. Sometimes it is life itself.
Agreed. And I feel like for me, and I feel like I am a pretty wide reading woman, you know, I haven't heard of those last two stories or any of those names. And I feel like that's an exciting discussion about banned books and challenged books, because we hear a lot of the titles over and over and over again. And so those are discussions about those titles that I've never heard. So I love that we get to kind of introduce the community to really suppressed voices that we haven't even heard of. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I'm interested in, we hear a lot about censorship, about LGBTQ books being challenged, and you know this, and you have it covered in some senses. This is the great work that public libraries in the US do. Right. Librarians in schools, in public libraries are constantly thinking about intellectual freedom, right, freedom of access, all of that. And the last one more book I feel everyone who can read English should be able to read. And this is a book I want to, sorry, I had it here and I think I must have moved it. May I just interrupt?
Sure.
Just a second. I'm going to turn off the video for a second.
Okay. So for everyone who's watching too, I'll just say, we'll put all of the titles and authors, or I'll put all the titles and authors into YouTube, into the description, so that people can be sure and access those titles and know, because I certainly know I've taken notes, but I'm certain misspelled everyone's names. So
absolutely, and I might have we might have to talk a little bit after our discussion, so that I can make sure I have all of the references, all of the things that I've talked about. But the last book, and I would say, first of all, that your library should acquire this book. And I'm sorry, I always put these covers on it because I was brought up, I'm sorry, I was going to say brought up by nuns, but I went to a Catholic school run by nuns, and we always brown paper covers. It's called The Devil's Dance. And this is the most recent, the first novel from the Uzbek language to be translated into English. And the writer is Hamid Ismailov. And he was exiled in 1992 after Uzbekistan stopped being, part of the Soviet Union and became an independent country. It was taken over by former Stalinists, former Soviet types, and Hamid Ismailov was banished or was exiled for troublesomely democratic tendencies, right? And so he went and he lived in the UK, worked for the BBC, and he wrote this novel in Uzbek and published it on his Facebook page, chapter by chapter. And they were read by Uzbek people and it became a sensation. And it is a historical novel of one of the first modern writers of Uzbek. In Uzbek, his Abdullah Qadiri is his name, and he was a real novelist who wrote a great novel, and who was writing a second one when he was arrested in the Stalinist purges in 1934, just like Osip Mandelstrom. And his great novel is lost. So it is a novel within a novel. So he's writing a novel about a real poet from the 1800s, a woman poet, who was the wife, Nadira is her name, who was the wife of 3 different rulers, emirs of Uzbek before the Russians took over. So it's a historical novel within a historical novel, which tells you, and it is full of poetry. So in between, he embeds a lot of the classical Uzbek poetry. And he says, I'm writing this book so that it is a repository for present readers of Uzbekistan, Uzbek language, to remember their own language, to encounter their own poetry, all of it which might be lost, and which he writes into the story. And my students, the first time I read it in, I think, over the summer, and I put it on my reading list for the fall. And the students loved it because they said, imagine people expressing their anger or their disappointment through poetry. And there are these sort of poetry circles, women's poetry circles, where the new bride who comes into the emir's harem has to recite poetry, and there are these reciting mehfils and so on. It's one of the most glorious novels. It's called The Devil's Dance, and I cannot recommend it enough. It is by an Uzbek writer called Hamid Ismailov. And you will have so many pleasures of discovering so many layers of literary and historical treasures, and I recommend it.
Well, we will commit to buying it here at our library for sure. I've written that down. This was a glorious walk, kind of a stroll through really suppressed voices and unknown authors, unknown titles, and historical moments that have been quiet. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. I mean, your passion is, we could talk for hours, I'm sure. And we're getting back to in-person programming in the fall. Perhaps we can have you here live and in person at some point to kind of do a follow-up for this. It would be great. There's one question that I love to ask anyone who comes to talk at the library, and is, what are you currently reading? And it might not be connected at all to our topic, but I'd love to know what you are reading right now. What's on your nightstand?
My books are in piles. So
oh my, yes.
At the moment reading, I'm sorry, this, I just began this last night, so I may not be able to tell you very much. And it's sadly discarded from the Volusia County Public Library in Daytona Beach, Florida.
Oh my, okay.
This is a Slovenian novel. I've not read many Slovenian novels, and I don't.
Sure.
Mojca Kumerde is a Slovene writer, philosopher, and critic, and it is a novel in which looks at Central Europe in the 16th century, a territory plagued by ceaseless battles for supremacy between the Protestant political elite and the ruling Catholic Habsburg. I'm very interested in Prague, Czech literature, and Czech Republic is one of my passions. And anytime you want me to talk about Czech dissident literature, I am only just learning to read Czech, but
wow.
I've read a lot of the Czech in translation, as much as is available almost.
So that just sounds like some light summer reading right there.
No, all of my reading is always light. And the other one that I'm really looking forward to reading is A History of the Enlightenment, which I'm also a big fan of. It's about 1,000 pages and sitting right there.
Yeah,
very
gosh.
invitingly.
These are tomes that you're reading. These
yes.
books are...
Yeah, this book is called The Harvest of Kronos, and the chapters, it is fascinating. I always love to discover what many different languages do with the novel form. Yeah. Like you think you know the novel, it's a story, but the chapter lengths and the things that they do, and especially the women writers these days, I used to be resistant to the idea of thinking of writers as women or men and so on. But Olga Tokarczuk, maybe you have already come across her name.
No.
Oh my gosh, if you have not yet acquired Olga Tokarczuk, she just won the Nobel Prize.
Okay.
And her books are very accessible, very readable, but also give you such a great sense of what it means to be European at this moment, and what it means to be human, climate change. And she's interested in all kinds of things. So,
well, I know my to-read list has just gotten longer after this hour, which is great. I only have about 5,000 books on my Goodreads list, so
I know,
5,010 now.
I know, but this is what I do to my students. They're like, oh, it's not enough that you're putting all these books on your list, and then every class you say, oh, you should read
more.
X.
Right. Right, and every book carries this, you have to read this one is so good, you have to read it. And you're like, I will, I'll put it on my list. But thank you so much. Hopefully we can have you back, and we'll I can meet you in person. Thank you so much for this journey. It was enlightening and beautiful and informative and inspiring, and hopefully everyone enjoys it. And I will stop the recording. So thanks everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you, bye.